Hi, I'm Olivia.
I'm Matt.
Hey, I'm Jason,
I'm Kelly.
I'm Paul.
and we're gonna discuss Frank O'Hara's poem Autobiographia Literaria. Um, so we've been discussing for the past month and a half American poetry up until the 1960s. And so my first question to the group would be, how does this poem fit in or not fit in with what we've looked at already, which is a very diverse array of writing? See, Olivia?
How does this poem relate?
Or how does it, like, what do you see as similar or different?
Well, I think it's similar to some of the earlier stuff we did, like William Carlos Williams, in that there's a simplicity and like when he talks about the last plums and it was delicious, especially in the first paragraph. When I was a child, I played by myself, but then you also see sort of this like isolation and loneliness that he expresses, and it's almost like a nursery rhyme attempt at something more confessional, which we read later. Like, I cried out, I am an orphan. So in that way, it's very different from something William Carlos Williams would do, or like an Images would do. Yeah, and then it sort of also harkens back to, not that we talked about this in this class, but like Walt Whitman, he sort of has that vibe at the end where he's like, and here I am, the center of all beauty, like that has to be influenced by Whitman, even though we didn't touch on him as much. He's always there in the distance as this cornerstone of American poetry.
Definitely. So, thanks. I think that really, I think the Williams is really relevant because Williams was interested in the objects around him and the people around him, just the way that O'Hara is. But let's see, just so it has a very particular title. The text is fairly straightforward, but the title is in Latin. So so we just talked about this, but what can you kind of tell? What is the significance of the title? So we'll move to Matt.
Well, it's interesting, I think, because when he mentions this in Latin, it's very much the root of all language. And in this, him talking about his childhood, it's the root of himself.
Right.
So I think drawing about parallels of kind of maturation and like development of language, kind of paralleling the development of self. And I think it's kind of ties in nicely at the end, where it's like the center of all beauty in the writing of these poems. That being the language that he's developed and the memories that he is so like plainly like laid out for someone.
Right.
To show like, however you may develop, you know, someone who hates dolls or hates games, someone you would expect not to be creative, has developed into such a way to write these poems.
Right.
And I think presenting it in such a way with like a title wrapping it up, where it's like, why is this in Latin? It's like, well, this was the root of what I produced, and this is the root of myself in this poem.
Great. And do you remember what? So I'm going to put it back up on the screen where we were. Let's see, where did it go? So we were looking at the Samuel Taylor Coleridge Autobiographia Literaria. So, Irene, if in a moment you could look at this, turn the camera to the screen. Not yet. Meanwhile, so while I'm calling up this literary object with the same title from, over 100 years before this was written, Kelly, could you just tell us about your experience in just hearing the poem and kind of how each stanza affected you.
I very much view this poem as a story, which is different from some of the previous works that we've touched on, and stylings. Like the images was very different. The language in this I found to be similar to some of the other stylings, in the sense that it was paratactic, so everything had equal weight.
Right.
Much like Gertrude Stein would have focused on. But I get this sense of excitement from reading this, and especially with the equal weight in here, everything to him seems to have the same amount of impact on him, whether he's crying out that he's an orphan or that he is enjoying the beauty of the poetry that he's writing. He just seems to be reveling in life and the excitement of it.
Does the poem kind of give you a lift? Like, does it convey a kind of positive energy?
I think so, despite the possible negative connotations for someone being an orphan and like hating dolls and not really having a good relationship. But in the end, I think it comes full circle.
If I told you that O'Hara was not an orphan, how would you feel?
It wouldn't change how I read the poem.
Okay.
Like, even though I read it as a story, I'm not reading it as like this is really his autobiography.
Okay.
Because I don't know that.
Okay. Interesting. So, on the film, right now, I'm going to have inserted images of Coleridge's Autobiographia Literaria, so you can see what it looks like compared to the poem. And now we'll come back to us, and so I'm curious, Paul, about how serious this poem is, in a way. So if this kind of very simple language and playful, so in a way, the child may or may not be an orphan. All we know, we only have, it doesn't say I was an orphan in the text. I am an orphan is in quotes. So we just were reading part of Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp, in which things were put in quotation. Camp is the art of kind of putting everyday objects and famous things and people into put them under quotation marks, so we're aware of them as a kind of performance. And so I wonder if I asked you to think about this poem in which O'Hara has the audacity to take a title from Samuel Coleridge, one of the great esteemed poets of the 19th century in English. And this is very early on in his writing career, in O'Hara's writing career. Is that a bold move? And to write something that flies kind of so in the face of Coleridge's kind of prosaic seriousness. I wonder if we think of this, how we can think of this as a performance.
Okay, yeah, so I think actually, like, looking at it again, I think my reading of it was a little too somber. I actually do think that some of this is like kind of tongue-in-cheek, like I hated dolls and games, like it's kind of too like strange things to point out about what they're, but they are symbols of childhood, and like animals, like even animals weren't friendly and birds would just fly away at the sight.
Right.
And then, I mean, I didn't know for a fact whether or not Frank O'Hara was an orphan, but like I was just by the way that line was presented, I was like, he's not really an orphan. He's just kind of saying that to like get people away from him for whatever reason.
Right.
It's almost kind of like I feel like it's kind of kicking back with a friend, just like reminiscing on childhood, and then like he's just kind of sitting there like, yeah, you're here I am, even though all this I was this as a child. So I do think that definitely there is this element in this poem in a lot of ways is like kind of can be read as funny, like
Right. Yeah, what do other people think? Do you agree, or do you want to disagree with Paul?
No, I think it's a little bit tongue in cheek. I mean, I don't know Coleridge particularly well, but I think of like Wordsworth, who's one of his best correspondences, and he had sort of this like romantic nostalgia for childhood, and this is sort of anti-Wordsworth. It's this like childhood wasn't that great, not even the animals would play with me.
Right.
And I think he's just sort of taking all the romance out of childhood, and he's doing it in a way that is like less nuanced than we know he can write. Like I think of Frank O'Hara like being very visceral and like I hated dolls and games. It's just sort of like a monotonous list. So I think that's purposeful, and I think he's sort of parodying like poems he's read like this.
Right. Well, what I wonder, there are two last things I wanted to draw our attention to before we finish. There is that line, those words, I am an orphan. And this is just a matter of the line break. I don't know if anyone wants to pick this up. What could you tell me about the effect of the line break on those words? What does it cause to happen?
It causes, if they're looking for him, he's like, I am, and you almost think he's gonna say here, and then he sort of loses his nerve and his like desire to communicate with the outside world, and goes back to an orphan. Like, I am by myself. You can't find me. You can't like penetrate this facade.
Yeah, I mean, I am is like what God calls himself in the Bible, in the Old Testament. I mean, I am is a bold assertion, and then in a kind of parallel where form and content parallel themselves, an orphan, the words stand alone on their own line, right? So they're kind of orphaned words just as much. And the other thing I wanted to look at to think about as we finish is the last word or the last line. So who is that spoken? Who is that last line directed at?
I think it might be directed at himself. And I think he finds a surprise in here that he was non-traditional, non-consumerist with playing with dolls and stuff, and he still found himself in a place where he was encapsulated by beauty and able to create poetry.
Right. Well, who else might? If we take that, if you like read the poem backwards, start with the last line. Like, what kind of command? I mean, to me, it has an exclamation point, and there's like the kind of campy phrase of saying like, oh well, imagine that, right? Where he's just saying, oh, imagine like, so he's kind of quoting that kind of language, but as one, I mean, it's the only word that is it's the only line comprised of one word, right? So, and that the last line in the 3 previous stanzas is how many words?
2, but yeah.
Right. And so what is the first letter of imagine?
I.
Right. So, but just think about, and think about like, what's on one end of the line and what's on the other end of the line? Do they resemble each other?
The explanation point.
The explanation point and the I resemble each other. So it's this weird, this integrated last word, as opposed to the all alone, flew away, an orphan. But if we were to think about that last line as being almost an invocation or kind of the turning, like breaking the fourth wall and turning towards the reader, as much as simultaneously it is his own astonishment at the fact that he's able to do what he can. Because of course, anything in a poem can mean can create multiple effects at the same time and contain many valences. So what if that was directed at if we read it as a kind of command?
Then I think this piece would be more along the lines of like, I was non-traditional, I did this stuff, and imagine that I turned out okay, you can too.
Right. Well, what if, and this is me pushing it, I'm reaching here for to kind of go the other direction, to go the other direction. If his command is to imagine, what does that do to the rest of the poem?
It makes you,
So if imagine like spills back like a knocked over milkshake and pours over the rest of the poem, what does it do to the poem?
it kind of makes it all have this sparseness to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it makes it kind of an act of the imagination, right? So it might be imaginary and it might not, but it's the center of all beauty nevertheless, right? Does anyone have anything else?
It's also
Yeah, go
just
ahead.
coming back to the title, like an autobiography
Mhm.
is sort of not the opposite, but so different from something of the imagination, because one is nonfiction and one is fiction, and he's sort of blurring them together, and that like beauty knows like no realness or fakeness. It's
Right.
like in the eye of the beholder.
Right, great. All right, well, on that note, we close here, and we'll see you inside In Memory of My Feelings and some other works.